Hello and welcome to this Advanced Lighting Practices for Maya and Arnold course. This course will be about exploring production level shot lighting techniques to create beautiful, realistic and faithful lighting. There are some fundamentals that can help, so I want to demonstrate how by applying these techniques creatively, your lighting can be elevated and the quality of your images can advance. I believe that capturing information from reality and feeding that data into the 3D process can help you get a long way towards creating very realistic CG. If you put in real data, you get out real results. It makes sense to me. Lighting is no exception at all. In fact, applying this logic to physically based render engines like Arnold can produce wonderful, faithful, and realistic results. The idea with this course is to throw out many of the defaults in Maya and Arnold and take real artistic control of your renders. So in this first class, I want to take this opportunity to set up a few technical parameters that we're going to use throughout the course, introduce you to a few terminologies that we'll use throughout the course as well. And I also want to talk a little bit about some of the fundamental philosophies that we are going to introduce throughout this course. So this is our zombie truck asset, and we're going to be seeing a little bit of this later on in the course. In fact, there's 3 classes dedicated to lighting and rendering this inside of a shot with a camera track included and all of that sort of stuff, HDRIs, environment maps and projections. But for now, I just want to use it as an example to talk through some of the technical parameters we're going to use on this course. So firstly, we're always going to be working at 25 FPS. So let's come down to the settings. Let's find the time slider options underneath categories here on the left-hand side. And we're going to switch our frame rate to 25. We're going to be working at 25 FPS for the duration of this course. So it's good to work in whole numbers, not in subframes. So let's just change our playback start and end to 1, and then let's set a default of 100 for the end. And the animation start and end is 1 and then 100. Another technical thing that we want to square away right off the bat as well is our color management. Now, this course is an artistic course. We're not going to be delving too deeply into the nuances of color management and color handling inside Maya and Arnold, color spaces and all that sort of stuff. We just want to get it set up so we can square it away and not come back to it. So head over to the color management category. And we're going to be using the ACES OCIO config for the duration of this course. Now, if you haven't worked with ACES before, don't worry about it too much. We're just going to set it up and we're going to leave it alone. But you are going to need to download and use the ACES OCIO config. Now, if you don't work with ACES and you haven't done this already, you need to head over to the Arnold documentation. That's here at docs.arnoldrenderer.com, and you need to come down and find the ACES workflow. Now, there's a whole load of very, very useful information on this page to do with the ACES workflow, and if you're not familiar with it, it's definitely worth a read. There's a lot of insightful information in here. But for now, all we want to do is come down and find this section underneath workflow and download and head over to GitHub, following this link. And we're looking for the Open Color IO configs, ACES 1.0.3. Okay, so go ahead and get this downloaded and store it somewhere on your system. I'm going to head back over to Maya. And right away, I'm going to click on the File tab in the right-hand corner here. Now, I've got my location for my OCIO config bookmarked, and I keep it in my program files Autodesk and then OCIO. You need to come in and find ACES 1.0.3, grab the config file, and hit open. Then all you have to do is hit Use OCIO Configuration. And for the duration of this course, the view transform that we're going to use, instead of sRGB as a default, we're going to use Rec 709 ACES. Our input color space is going to be Utility Raw, and we need to hit Reapply Rules to the scene, and then come down and hit Save. Okay, so your view transform should now be set to Rec 709 ACES. You can turn that on and off up here. And if you want to, you can gamma up and down and change the exposure as well. But for now, we're just going to leave this as default. So I want to use this lesson as an opportunity to make you familiar with some of the terms and some of the practices that we're going to be using throughout the course. One big part of that is applying real-world light data to area lights and throwing out a bunch of the default settings so we can get something more realistic. So let's say, for example, we want to put a bunch of tube lights or fluorescent tubes above the top of this car. They would cast light down and they would be quite a soft light. So what we would probably use for that is something like an area light. So if we come up to the Arnold menu and find the area light, drop one of those inside of our scene. I'm going to translate it up and rotate it around a little bit, and I'm going to stretch it out so it's more or less the rough dimensions of a, let's say, a tube light or a fluorescent light on a ceiling. Let's rotate it around so it roughly aligns with the car. Okay, great. Maybe we'll just move it up a little bit as well. And as some default settings, I'm going to change the intensity to 1000 for now and turn our exposure all the way up to 5. Let's head over to the render settings, and we're going to put in just a few default settings here. Let's shift from HD 540 to 1080, just so we've got plenty of resolution to play with. Let's leave tiled on and half precision off, and go to Arnold render. Camera AA will be 5 for this example, and underneath adaptive sampling, let's enable that and switch that to something like 7. And underneath ray depth, let's switch the diffuse to 2. This is going to be fine for this example scene. To help us compare and contrast, let's create another camera. Let's go to cameras and create a camera. Let's call this render cam. Back into the render settings, over to the common tab, and switch from perspective to render cam. Close this out. Let's drop the render cam into the viewport, zoom out a little bit. Let's frame it up so we've got something nice here. We can also turn on our resolution gate to help us frame up. Maybe we can move our light down a little bit to keep it inside the scene for context. Let's go to Arnold, open Arnold render view, render and update full scene. Alright, so let's hit F on the keyboard just to frame that up. So interesting, straight away, it's not desperately inspiring. Let's go over to render and abort render. Very, very flat and overexposed. So the first thing that we might want to do is just bring the exposure down. Let's knock that down to something like 2. I don't think a fluorescent tube would ever be as bright as that. Let's go to render and update full scene. Okay, so let's go to render and abort render. Again, it's looking, for lack of a better phrase, incredibly CG at the moment. And we want to get away from that in these classes. We want to start making things that look a lot more realistic. So with our default settings in our area light representing something roughly the size and shape of a tube light, we get something that doesn't look realistic at all. Something that we could do to help out is perhaps reduce the spread. So let's bring this down to 0.5. This is almost certainly going to make our light appear brighter as well. So let's change our exposure to 0. Back to our render view. Render and update full scene. Okay, so we could pretend that above this car now we've got a fluorescent tube light and it's casting some light down, but it still doesn't look particularly real. So let's go to render and abort render. I think in a car park scenario like this, you may have several of these lights as well. So let's go and add those in. With the light selected, I'm going to go to edit and duplicate special and hit the options. And I'm going to reset my settings. We definitely want to use copy, and we're going to duplicate input graph, which is always good practice when we're duplicating lights. And number of copies 2, duplicate special. And let's spread these out a little bit. Let's move them one maybe a bit closer to the front of the car so we can pick up some details there. And one a bit closer to the back of the car so we can pick up some details there. And if we're being completely realistic, these things will never be hung straight. So let's rotate them around a little bit and make it a bit more janky. All right, great. So let's just move this back a little bit so we can see what's going on here. Let's find our render view again, render and update full scene. Let's go to render and abort render. Okay, so even though we've added more lights in, it's still looking desperately CG. Let's try and pick out a few more details on the front just before we move on to adding a little bit more realism into this scene. So let's minimize this. And let's bring this area light well over the front of the car, somewhere around about here. We can move it up a little bit. And to get a little bit more even spacing, we can move this one as well. We can also move them slightly in the direction of the camera to help us out too. Let's go back in and frame up. Something like this is looking pretty good. A nice low angle. Let's go over to our render view, render and update full scene. Okay, so this can do for our comparison. Maybe if we want to be a little bit more generous to the default settings inside of an area light, we could manipulate their shape a little bit to help them better match a fluorescent tube. So let's minimize the render view and select one of our lights here. We can adjust the roundness and the soft edge a little bit as well. We can also scroll down and turn up the camera visibility so we can see this particular light in our viewport. Open up the render view, render and update full scene. Okay, so let's apply those settings to the other lights before we move on to creating some far more realistic lighting in this scene, just for a fair comparison. So let's minimize the Arnold render view. Let's grab this light back here, turn the camera visibility up, and we can add in some soft edge and a little bit of roundness. And again, for this one, just up at the top of our viewport, a little bit of roundness, a bit of soft edge. We can also scroll down and make this one visible to the camera, but at the moment it's outside our viewer anyway. Open up the render view, render, and update full scene. Okay, so let's just take a snapshot of this, and we're going to use this as our comparison frame. I have an empty snapshot in here, so I'm just going to go in and delete that one. So let's come up and take a look at some of these lights here. If we turn our exposure down, and then maybe even down as far as -10, we can see that inside of our lights, they're completely flat. There's no dynamic range. There's no realism to the lights whatsoever. So in terms of them being a realistic light source and casting out realistic light into our scene, we're really going to struggle here. If we sample the pixels, they're essentially the same flat color all the way along. Now, to create realistic lighting in your scene, this is no good. And what we want to try and do for this introductory class is create some realistic and faithful looking tube lighting for our car here. We've got this really nice asset and we want to use some really nice lights to light it. So with this stored as our comparison, we're going to move on to the next phase of this class. I'm going to minimize the render view and select our first light that we put into the scene, which is this light up here. And I'm going to reset some of these settings. So let's turn off the roundness, let's turn off the soft edge. We're going to turn our spread all the way up, although this may come down a little bit later on. And I'm going to do that for all of the lights. So spread back up, roundness down, and soft edge down, and then the same for this one as well. But we are going to keep the camera visibility in here. That's going to be important. So what we're going to do to these lights to match them much more closely to a fluorescent tube is we're actually going to use a HDR image of a fluorescent tube in these lights. You'll be aware that you can plug in different colors into your lights, but you can also plug in images as well. And to talk you through the images that we're going to use in these lights, we need to jump over to Nuke. So here in Nuke, I've got some stuff down here in the node graph, and I've got something up here in my viewer as well, but let's just ignore that for this moment. This class is all about getting us set up with some of the technical parameters and some of the philosophies in this course. And one of the technical parameters that we're going to use inside of Nuke, again, is the ACES color workflow. So in the node graph, I'm going to tap S on the keyboard, and I'm going to come over to the color tab, And in color management, switch from Nuke to OCIO, and OCIO config up to ACES 1.0.3. Now I have this stored in Nuke by default. Again, I'm going to change our view transform to Rec 709. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've got here. We've got HDR bracket down here, and I'll explain what that is in just a second. But we just need to change the color space on these files quickly. So let's double click on these read nodes and change our input color space from default texture paint to data utility raw. And we're going to do that for all of them. They'll just display more correctly this way. Okay, there we go. I'm also going to double click on our HDR node as well and change that to data utility raw as well, just so it all matches. And let's close out the properties panel. Okay, so this is a HDR bracket and we've got 5 images, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they run from underexposed, where we're not really clipping any of the highlights, to slightly overexposed, where we're not really clipping any of the shadows. This bracket of images was taken on a Sony mirrorless camera, so a long exposure here and a quick exposure here, hence the darker image and the brighter image. The idea is that we take these raw files, we convert them to TIFFs, and then we compile them to an HDR image. And we're going to go through the whole process of doing that later on in the course. But for the purposes of this class, we're just going to use the result, which is this HDR image here. If I come up to my viewport and we turn the gain down, we can see that we've got a really good dynamic range in here. So in the brighter areas, we've got more than 30. And this is going to serve us really well. The idea is that we take an image like this, plug it into an area light, and we should be able to create some sort of realistic tube lighting effect. One thing to watch out for is that the area lights inside of Maya are by default square. And this is a rectangle. It's 3000 pixels by 346. So if we apply this to an area light, it's going to come out so distorted that it's not going to look realistic. So what we want to do is crop this down. We've also got the added issue of the bulb only taking up maybe 1/3 of the image height. So we want to crop a lot of this stuff out and crop off the stuff at the ends, because that's not going to really contribute very much. So I'm going to hit Tab on the keyboard, create a crop node. I'm going to pull this in. We want to keep a little bit of this stuff around the edges because it's supposed to be a realistic light, but not too much because it's not going to contribute a great deal. Okay, so we're going to take some of that stuff off. We'll leave some of this stuff on the end as well because it's a little bit interesting. And the same here too. I'm going to come out, hit reformat to get rid of the pixels. Make sure blackout size turned off. Close out the properties for this. Now what we need to do is reformat this into a square. So let's drop down a reformat node. Let's change our output format to 1K square and resize type to distort. Okay, there we go. When we plug this into an area light and then deform the area light to the shape of the bulb, we'll get something that much more closely represents a tube light. So I'm going to hit right, W on the keyboard to create a right node. I'm going to copy this path from the read node, paste it into the right node, and I'm going to version up to version 2. Okay, and we're going to write an ACES compliant EXR. Let's get rid of these panels here so we can see what we're doing with this right node. We're going to switch our color space to data utility raw, hit render, turn continue on error off, make sure we're only rendering one frame, and hit OK. Okay, so that's rendered that out for us. Let's copy this path, hit R on the keyboard to read it in. Let's press 2 and then 1 to compare between the right node and what we've actually written out. Check the colors. And it looks like the same thing, so that's absolutely fine. So with this path still copied, we're going to head back over to Maya. I'm going to select the first area light that we put into our scene and come over to the color attribute. And I'm going to attach a file node. I'm going to paste our HDR image into here. In our case, that's actually inside the source images folder. It's right here. So make sure that's there, hit open. Utility raw matches the color space that we wrote it out as, so that's all good. Now we just want to attach this to the other three lights, so I'm going to select all three of our lights, open up the hypershade. Let's head over to the lights tab. I'm going to graph our three lights. We can see that this HDR image is plugged into the color of our first light. We're just going to connect that to the other two. Okay, so we've got one HDR, the same HDR that's going into all three lights, just for a bit of efficiency there. Let's jump back to the scene view. And one thing that we want to do before we go any further is make sure that the orientation of our HDR in these lights is correct. So to do that, I'm going to switch over to the perspective camera. Now I'm just going to frame up on one of these lights here in the viewport. I can turn on our resolution gate as well. Now if our HDR is orientated 90 degrees in the wrong direction, it's not going to stretch from end to end, rather be compressed side to side, and we don't want that. So let's just double check. Remember that we've got our camera visibility all the way to 1 here. Open up the render view. Let's deselect our snapshot. Let's change our render camera to perspective shape, render and update full scene. Okay, obviously very, very bright. Doesn't look that different from the area light we had before. But let's go to render, abort render, and let's bring down our exposure. Okay, so we can see that we've got some dynamic range in here. It's brighter in the middle than it is at the edge, but it's obviously orientated the wrong way. It's squished widthways. So we need to reorientate our HDR map to go into this light. Now we can do that inside Maya, it's really simple. Let's minimize the render view, go back to the hypershade. Let's grab our place 2D texture node, and we're going to rotate the UV 90 degrees. And that'll just orientate our HDR to the shape of our light. Okay, so let's close this out. Head back to the old render view, let's double check. Render, update full scene. Render and abort render. Okay, so we can see that we've got our light mapped inside of our light really nicely here. And if we go to our pixel option over on the top right hand corner and we scroll through, the major difference is now we've got plenty of dynamic range in here, lots of different values, lots of realistic values. So this is looking really good. And then to retain yet more information from this light source, let's change the resolution. So let's head back to our scene view, and here underneath resolution, we rendered this at 1K. So let's change this to 1024 and hit enter on the keyboard. And let's repeat that for the other two lights as well. So 1024 and 1024. Let's double check, make sure everything's all good. Render, update full scene. Okay, so that's looking nice. That's definitely a fluorescent bulb that we've got there, so that's looking great. Let's go to render and abort render. Let's switch our camera to our render cam, go to render and update full scene. Okay, so let's switch our exposure back to 0. Okay, so it looks like we're really overexposed at this point. So let's go back to our lights and we can dial that down a little bit. So let's minimize our render view. Let's select all three of our lights. Go to the channel box, change our intensity to 100. And that'll apply it to all three lights. Back to the render view, render, update full scene. Okay, so let's abort that render there. A little bit, maybe a touch underexposed. So let's just dial in a stop into each one of these lights and we'll call it good. So selecting all three lights, back to the channel box, exposure, I'm going to change this to 1. And maybe we can reduce the spread to 0.8, something like that. Back to our render view, render, update full scene. Okay, still a little bit overexposed, I think. So to make this perfect, let's just knock it down a little bit more. I think maybe the spread has brightened things up a little bit too much. Abort render. Let's change our exposure to 0.2. Open up the render view, render and update full scene. All right, it's a final tweak. Let's just abort that render. And let's head back over and let's just take the AI spread all the way back up to 1. And I think we should be good. So let's go render and update full scene. Okay, so it's already looking much more interesting. Let's go down to our snapshot from our default area light and compare the two. So this is our default, and this is our fluorescent tube. This is our default, and this is our fluorescent tube. Now there's an obvious shift in the color, but also all of the highlights are looking far more interesting, as well as the shadows. Let's zoom in and take a closer look. So over here on the grill where we've got this chrome material, if we head over to our default settings and bring our exposure down, we've got quite a flat color here. I've got quite flat highlights here on the wing mirror and on the windshield as well. But if we switch back to our HDR render, we've thrown a ton more detail into the highlights. And this is really valuable when we're trying to create faithful and realistic renderings. Okay, so let's switch our exposure back to 0. And we can zoom out, hit F on the keyboard to frame it up. In this example, the effect is quite subtle, but it's in these subtleties that we find a lot of the realism in our renders. Now we can couple this with a whole bunch of other techniques like introducing lat-long HDRs to give some environmental lighting and help with our reflections and our transmissions. But we're going to save that for later in the course. But what we can do to round this class off nicely is introduce a little bit of atmospherics quickly. So let's close down the render view, head over to the render settings, go over to Arnold Render underneath environment. Let's head down to the atmosphere and create an AI atmosphere volume. And with that selected, let's head over to the attribute editor. And we're going to apply a very small amount of density. So 0.001 should be sufficient for this scene. Let's head back to the render view, render and update full scene. Okay, so let's abort the render there. So the volume's added something nice to our little setup, but the point of this exercise was to apply some real-world photographic material to our lights to try and create a more photographic result in our render. And I think we've managed to achieve that. If we look at the default settings versus our HDR settings, we've got a much more realistic real-world render here. But we've just scratched the surface of what we can do in Arnold using techniques like this. Coming up in this course, we're going to dive into how to create HDR maps like the ones that we've got in these lights. We'll be working with HDR lat-longs and working with those inside a projection setup to get even more realistic reflections and environmental lighting. We're also going to be doing exciting stuff with moving image HDRs where we use HDR image sequences. We're actually going to be using real-life wax candles for that, which is going to be a lot of fun, along with a whole bunch of other production techniques. So I hope you've enjoyed this class, and I hope to see you in the next class.